Good morning. My name is Peter Gore. I'm the Executive Vice President at the Maine State Chamber of Commerce. I have scrolled through the names real quickly and I recognize familiar faces. And we welcome you to our webinar this morning, Returning to the Workplace, Navigating Legal and Leadership Best Practices, and it's presented by Verrill. And we have two very helpful and experienced attorneys with us this morning to help us and make this presentation possible. It is presented by Verrill with our community sponsors, Bangor Savings Bank, Northern Light Health, St. Germain, and our supporting sponsors, Central Maine Power, Eaton Peabody, and Maine Employers Mutual, MEMIC. Before we get started this morning, we're going to do a couple of quick ground rules for people, and we're going to put them up there. Usually I let folks know, but the meeting is being recorded to reduce background noise. You are only all in listen mode, but that doesn't mean you can't ask questions. As a matter of fact, we in the panel encourages questions. If you have them, please put them into the chat function at the bottom. We've all done enough Zoom webinars to know where that is. And as the presentation goes along, I've spoken with both Rob and Elizabeth, and we are going to ask questions as they come up. There will be some hypotheticals according to Rob at the end, and they may answer some of your questions. But in case they don't, we encourage you to ask them. And then there's some instructions if you happen to lose your Zoom connection, how to reconnect. And one more thing, we get asked this a lot. The meeting is being recorded, as I said earlier, but it will be available for a review on our webpage, and it will be accessible through social media, the Chamber's social media functions as well. So you will be able to see this again if you missed something and you want to go back and listen for additional clarity. And there we are. And so this morning we are joined by two attorneys, Rob Brooks and Elizabeth Johnston. I have known Rob for a long time through the workers' comp world. Both Rob and Liz are experienced attorneys dealing with many of the issues that we all have questions about. As employers, we consider returning our workers into their workspaces, what those challenges are, what employers may need to do, what they may not need to do, the issues around the vaccine mandate, which is even now being rolled out under executive order from the president. And there are a lot of questions about how the workplace will operate and what it will look like as we move forward. We hope and we think that Rob and Liz will be able to provide some clarity around these many questions. And so I'm going to hand it off to Liz Johnston to begin our presentation this morning. And again, if you have questions, don't hesitate to put them into the chat. With that, we're off and running. Liz?
Thanks, Peter. Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for being here with us this morning. My name is Liz Johnston, and I'm an employment and labor attorney at Verrill, and I'm here with Rob Brooks, who's a partner in Verrill's employment and labor group. We're really excited to be talking with you this morning about some really important issues related to COVID-19 and workplace safety. And we'd also like to thank the Maine State Chamber of Commerce for hosting this event to give us that opportunity to talk to you all. Next slide, please, Anne. So just a couple more really brief housekeeping matters. As Peter mentioned, please feel free to drop questions into the chat. We'll be monitoring that throughout the presentation and trying to get to those questions. If we don't get to your question, or if you don't have a chance to answer or to ask one, we will be providing a copy of the PDF of the presentation. So I think that'll be dropped into the chat pretty soon. We also, Rob and I welcome follow-up questions. Our email addresses are listed there and will be, of course, in the copy of the presentation. So if you have anything lingering, any outstanding questions, please feel free to reach out to us after the presentation as well. So what we're going to focus on today, our presentation really has two components. First, we're going to talk about sort of the different state of various workforces at this stage of the pandemic, We're going to be focusing on, of course, in-person work, the decision to reopen a workplace, as well as remote work and also hybrid work situations where you have employees working both in the office and remotely, and talking about the legal challenges and safety challenges that are associated with each of those different models, depending on where your workplace is at. The second part of our presentation will focus on COVID-19 vaccinations, particularly the state requirements and especially the federal requirements, federal contractor requirements, as well as what we know and what we don't regarding the 100-employee mandate that we expect to be issued really soon. So we'll be talking about those, as well as the, of course, legal risks and considerations for your workplace that'll be related to those mandates.
Great, thanks, Liz. I think I'm up next, so we'll just dive right into the return to work. And I think as the title to this show implies, most of you, I assume, are interested in getting employees back into the office, and therefore, I assume you've got some people who are not yet back in the office or the workplace. And so, we'll talk for the next few minutes about some of the issues related to that. So what goes into this decision making? What are some of the best practices and legal considerations? It's pretty extraordinary that we're talking about this now. I mean, it only seemed like, 2 years ago that we were saying, actually, I remember March of 2020, I said to my assistant right around March 17, I said, okay, I'll see you in 2 weeks. And now it's been about 2 years, and I don't think anybody would have planned for that. But I think for a variety of reasons, most businesses are getting to the point where they feel they have to move on. They've got to do something to get back to a more normal routine, whether it's because of just productivity issues or just other business issues, employee retention issues, that just feel like they have to do something. And so it is a sort of an interesting point in this pandemic, where I think, notwithstanding the fact that cases are still at a relatively high level and the vaccines are out, but again, the cases are still high, I think employers just need to move on. So we're going to talk about that. So the next slide. So decision to reopen. So, first thing you've got to ask yourself is, well, are there any federal or state or local laws that will affect my decision to bring people back into the office or to increase the number of people in the office? And as of today, there, at least in Maine, there are no barriers from or rules from any state, federal or local agency that limits your ability to operate, unlike during the height of the pandemic, when we had the various executive orders coming from the governor that put limitations on which businesses could be open and for how long. So right now, that's all clear. So another thing, if you have a union, collective bargaining agreements may relate to your decision making as management. Do you have an obligation to bargain with the union about when people come back, who gets called back first, how many hours, what sort of safety protocols? Those are all things that relate to the terms and conditions of employment. And if you do have a union, then you ought to be at least looking at your collective bargaining agreement to see if that requires you to talk to the union. And even as a general rule, it's probably not a bad idea to consult with them before you go forward with a plan. So, this third bullet, we talk about whether reopening or increasing your number of people in the office or the facility is best for your business. And this is going to be a very fact specific or analysis, it's tailored to your own situation. So some of the things to think about in terms of making this decision is it's a risk assessment. You'll see here COVID-19 risk assessment. Well, what goes into that? If you look at what are the infection rates in the community? Are they going up? Are they going down? Is it a low level? Is it a high level of infection? What are the vaccination rates of your population, of employees, also of the population in general? Again, this is all about again, assessing risk. What's the likelihood that you opening up will impact your business in a negative way? And that could come from whether employees come in and there's an outbreak and your employees all have to go home and quarantine for some period of time, and therefore your productivity goes down. And so, we have a client in Texas, for instance, where the vaccination rates are pretty low, and so they were interested in having a vaccine mandate, but the vaccination rates are pretty low in Texas, and they're terrified that they'll have an outbreak and then they'll have to shut down production. They're already behind in whatever supply chain or whatever part of the supply chain they inhabit. So from their perspective, they're like, we need people vaccinated, we need people working, and we can't afford an outbreak because that'll just, shut our business down. Other people are more worried about different aspects of a COVID-19 outbreak. It's liability. Am I going to get sued by a customer or client who says they got COVID from one of my employees? And is that risk just so high? Like we got to keep people working remotely, or, and so those are some of the considerations that would go into the analysis. Also, can the work be done remotely? Have you, assuming you've been limping along for the last 18 months with some or all of your workforce working remotely, how's it going? Are you guys getting the work done? Is productivity satisfactory? Are you able to adapt? Are employees succeeding? And even if numbers are being hit in terms of production, what we're seeing now is a lot of attrition. I think the numbers came out for the month of August and nationally, and the number of employees quitting their jobs was just extraordinarily high. I think it caught a lot of people by surprise. And then there's lots of people scratching their heads. It's like, well, why is that? Is it because they've just decided to give up looking for a job because they're just frustrated? Is it because they don't like their employer? They've realized, what, I like working remotely and I don't need to work for this company. I can go to Mexico. And I have a nephew who actually during the pandemic went down to Mexico for 6 months to work because he's an IT guy who lives in Seattle and he can do that. Nobody knew where he was. And some people decided, that's not a bad lifestyle. Others are speculating it's because of the vaccine mandates being rolled out starting around August, where employers were starting to basically put that in place. And this is obviously before the federal mandates came out, but August was when, in Maine anyway, the governor announced the healthcare worker mandate, which we'll talk about later. So lots of speculation as to why people don't want to come back to work, but it's certainly it's an eye-opening and an interesting period of time that we're living through with respect to that. So again, if you force people to come back to work, maybe people don't want to come back to work and they leave. Other people are clamoring to come back to work and may leave if you don't bring them back. So it's an interesting situation. And in terms of other aspects of this analysis of whether you want to reopen, having a communication plans with employees is really important. Employees who are left to speculate about what's going to happen in the future, A, will be perhaps unhappy with the company, so you may have a morale issue, and B, they may decide, I'm going to go work somewhere else where I think my future is a little more certain. So keeping employees abreast of your decision making, even if it's just, hey, we're thinking about making a decision, we're getting to the point where we're going to be bringing people back, that would be a useful exercise. And one way you can do that is you do surveys. For instance, you can survey your employees, how many employees have been vaccinated, for instance, get a sense as to that level of risk of terms of having how many unvaccinated versus vaccinated people in the workplace. You can get a sense as to even safety. Do you have any concerns about coming back to the office? Do you have any requests for accommodation? And you can do this survey just anonymously or not, but an anonymous survey, maybe like using SurveyMonkey, is a pretty good tool to get data that may be a little more honest if people feel like they're not being tracked, and that may give you a better handle on what the best course is for your business. Another thing that you'll want to think about in terms of your decision to reopen is how are people going to react? Are there going to be people who will say, you know what, I don't want to come back, or they'll start requesting accommodations? There may be some concerns about safety. I don't feel safe coming back. And so think about how you'll want to address those. Next slide. So with respect to the this process of bringing people back, some other things to think about are what kind of protocols are you going to have as you bring people back? Will there be new safety protocols? For many, it's basically going to be the similar or same protocols you've had in place for the last year. But there may be some tweaking to that, such as for travel, vaccination, quarantine. You'll want to look at your practices and make sure that they're up to date. Training managers is especially important so that they are all speaking uniformly with respect to what the policy is. And so what you want to avoid having one manager have one set of rules and another manager operating by maybe the old set of rules, so that's from a year ago. So that's something to keep in mind. I mean, some companies really, and Liz will go into what goes into the policy, but some companies go all in. They'll have like a 25, 30-page policy on COVID management and coming back to the workforce. Those are typically bigger employers, but this can be a pretty involved process if you really dig into it. Some other things to consider when you're going to reopen, again, we talked about addressing concerns, requesting feedback. Be mindful of discrimination issues. Employees may say, how come you're bringing back the one group first over this other group that may be in a protected category? Be mindful of, again, whistleblower protection. We'll talk about this in more detail later, but anytime an employee says, I don't feel safe going back to the office, I think the hair on the back of your neck should go up and say, that could be somebody complaining about a safety issue in the office, which might put them in the category of a whistleblower under the Maine Whistleblower Protection Act. And as pretty much everybody on this call will realize that, the Maine Whistleblower Protection Act, among other statutes, but that one in particular has been weaponized in the view of many by lots of plaintiffs' lawyers as a way to essentially advance their employees, their clients or the employees' position or rights, if you will. And so you all, even outside of healthcare, now know what it's like to be in healthcare, where every time a nurse or other healthcare provider says, gee, I think there's a safety or a patient care issue or a safety issue at the hospital or the other healthcare facility, those are all sort of relate to whistleblower claims. But now pretty much every company is in a similar predicament. An employee comes in and says, I don't feel safe here because we've got infectious diseases running around with COVID in particular. And those people who complain about or make those concerns or report those concerns are potentially whistleblowers. And so I think that good news is that to the extent that everybody knows about the issue, there's some legal precedent that suggests that may not be protected activity, but we'll talk about that later. So I think Liz has got the next slide.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. So next, we're going to talk about some of the measures that you can take to help increase the safety of your workplace. And for a lot of you, if you've had workplaces that have been open over the past year or even past several months, a lot of this might be things that you've already implemented or you've heard about or considered. But I think it's important to recognize, though, that while we're learning to live with COVID, it is still prevalent, and we are still seeing rates escalate. Various surges that have gone on throughout the last year and a half, particularly with the Delta variant. And also considering new information that's coming out about the efficacy of vaccines after a certain period of time, whether or not we can rely as heavily on vaccination status as a protectant than as we maybe could have when vaccines were first starting to be administered. So I think it's worth revisiting some of these safety precautions and measures that you can take in the workplace, given where we are at. So if you are reopening or if you are already open, think about some of the ways that you could potentially make your workplace more, not COVID friendly, I guess, but COVID resistant. One of the ways to do that is with schedule modifications, thinking about whether there are modifications that you can make to your employee schedules to reduce the number of people in the workplace at one time, reduce the number of people in a certain wing or a certain department at one time, particularly if hybrid work or remote work is an option. That might be something to consider. Different ways that you can increase the availability of social distancing, whether it be by moving desks further apart or having employees complete tasks a little bit further apart, maybe than they used to pre-COVID or over the last few months. think about physical barriers that you can implement in the office. I know a lot of office environments have, and other environments have implemented things like plexiglass barriers between workstations, single direction hallways, things like that, that can help mitigate sort of the communication of the virus to the extent we can. Also think about risks associated with common areas in your workplace. Many workplaces have break rooms or places where employees eat meals together, spend time socializing, various size rooms for those purposes, conference rooms that are utilized for group meetings. Just consider, measures that you can take to reduce the number of people in those spaces or the density of crowded situations in those spaces. And along with that, relatedly, implementing cleaning procedures in your workplace, making sure that people have things like hand sanitizer available and that common areas in particular are being cleaned regularly to address the spread of germs in the office. So those are just some of the things that you can think about for if you are reopening or if you are already reopened or open as we go into the winter. Next slide, please. Thank you. So another thing that can be helpful is health screening. Again, when we talk about health screening, this is a lot of what you might have heard about sort of in the past months and past stages of the pandemic. But again, with where we're at, it's definitely worth considering for your workplace, depending on your industry and your risk assessment and what your employees are looking for. So, when we talk about health screening, we're talking about COVID testing, things like temperature checks, even sort of employee affirmations that they are not having symptoms when they enter the workplace. All of these types of measures can be effective in making sure that when employees are sick, they're not coming to work, and that reduces the liability for your other employees getting sick, as well as customers, clients getting sick as well. So even though, we've talked about in the past sort of how these types of screens like temperature checks, health screenings are going to be acceptable under the ADA, given the fact that we are in the pandemic. So, these are permissible things for employers to do, of course, if they're administered, correctly and in accordance with ADA measures and other various laws that are going to apply. And it's important to keep those in mind as well, right? So, think about Title VII, Maine Human Rights Act, Fair Labor Standards Act, OSHA, all of these employment-related laws and regulations are going to still be applicable to the type of screenings that you're implementing in your workplace. So, for example, when you're implementing screening, it's important to make sure that we're focusing on being fair and objective in our administration of screening to avoid sort of discrimination claim related to those practices. And as Rob was talking about, when we think about discrimination claims in terms of returning to the workplace, like which groups are being asked to return first versus being remote, think about what groups are being asked to health screen versus others. Not just a race or a gender issue, but also potentially related to vaccination status, because that can potentially, of course, implicate religious or disability related bases for treating people differently or subjecting to different screening based on those protected categories.
Yeah, and just to further that point, I think this may feel like deja vu. Like, I thought we did this last year, but here we are. I thought once we got the vaccines, we wouldn't have to do health screening anymore. We wouldn't have to wear masks anymore. But with the Delta variant and what happened over the summer, starting on Cape Cod when we had that big outbreak with among vaccinated people, it's clear that this CDC has now certainly acknowledged that vaccinated people can get infected with COVID and can transmit it. And that's why we're all wearing masks indoors again, right? We thought we could get rid of the health screening and the really indoor mask wearing if you got vaccinated. Mm-hmm. And so this is why I think it's important to keep track of the data in terms of this relates to health screening. Like, who presents a risk to you? And I think the short answer is everybody. Still, whether vaccinated or not, just Maine CDC data published just this week, 2 days ago. You know, the last week, I guess the first week of October, of all the new COVID cases in Maine, 38% were among fully vaccinated people. So that's, you know, that's the reality. And that's consistent with Massachusetts, where it's actually, I think, a little higher, so it's in the 40s. So again, that's just last week. So that could change, but again, I think it's important to acknowledge now that with respect to these screening policies, you should be mindful about applying them evenly, no matter whether they've been vaccinated or not, or if they've had COVID in the past or not, because reinfection may be an issue. So sorry, Liz, I'll turn it back to you.
Great points. And yeah, so, and in addition to sort of the even application, you know, like I mentioned, Fair Labor Standards Act, it's important to keep in mind that there might be wage and hour issues associated with screening. You know, asking employees to engage in testing is probably going to be something that you need to compense their time for the time spent engaging in that screening. Also thinking about safety issues, you know, for implementing temperature checks, making sure people are properly socially distanced while waiting for testing or waiting to go through a screening, making sure equipment is sanitized, those sorts of concerns. Lastly, and briefly, confidentiality is also an issue with health screenings. Medical information of employees is obviously confidential, and it does need to be kept separately from the employee's personnel file. So you'll want to make sure that you're complying with those requirements, as well as restricting who has access to that information. We can jump to the next slide. So returning to work, other policies to consider. First is implementing a COVID-19 infection policy. And what I mean here is having a policy in place regarding what an employee should do if they may have COVID, suspect they have a COVID infection, or if they do have COVID-19. So establishing a policy that says who should be notified, how employees should give notice, making sure that we're carving out a clear, accessible, understandable path for employees to make those reports, so that we aren't, you know, having text messages getting mixed, or to supervisors getting missed, or employees showing up to work to let a supervisor know that they've been exposed, things like that. You know, the goal is to encourage transparency and you know, avoid employees coming in if they're a potential threat to others. Think about other policies that might be implicated as well. So if we're working in person, you know, think about travel policies that you might have in place. You know, think about whether the CDC, either state or federal, has restrictions in place on quarantining, or what the appropriate you know, length of time is to wait after traveling to different countries or different areas. Making sure that your travel policies are accommodating that. Looking at leave policies to, you know, first understand what leave might be available under your own policies and under state law to employees that are needing leave to deal with a COVID-related issue. You know, we're past the federal leave provided for COVID or the vaccinations at this point, but that doesn't mean that like Maine earned paid leave couldn't be used for time spent getting a vaccine or home with symptoms or something like that. So revisit your leave policies, and of course remote work policies, which we're going to dive into here in just a moment, but thinking about how those are implicated by your current in-person versus remote situation. Lastly, consider a vaccine policy. You know, we're going to talk about vaccines later today, but you know, here we're referring to employer mandated rather than state or federal mandated policies. Some employers have, of course, decided to go the route of mandating vaccines, whereas others have simply encouraged it. And some are offering sort of incentives or in some cases disincentives to getting vaccinated. So really, this is going to be a workplace specific assessment based on your workforce and what your industry standards and what you need. So, you know, if you do consider a vaccine policy that's unrelated to state or federal mandates, though, just be prepared to address the religious and medical exemptions, as well as other requests for exception from the policy or accommodation, and also addressing the confidentiality issues associated with maintaining confidentiality of information regarding employee medical and vaccine status.
Make sure you know or be mindful of where your employees are living. So for instance, if they live in Texas, we've got a new executive order in Texas that prohibits employers from mandating vaccines as a condition of employment. And so that is certainly running headlong into the federal mandates for federal contractors and this anticipated OSHA mandate that's going to come down for employers with 100 or more employees. So, but you know, executive orders, that's like a law. And so if you have an employee working remotely from Austin, Texas, and you want to mandate vaccines, then you may be exposing yourself to a claim under Texas law that you're violating that law. So anyway, it's a pretty fluid situation, as we'll get into in a minute in terms of when we discuss the litigation around vaccines. All right, so I guess I'm up next, and we're going to talk about remote hybrid workforces. So Liz and I were just talking about bringing people back into the office, some of those issues. And what's another version of this, which is remote/hybrid workforces. Remote, of course, is all remote, and a lot of people have been doing that for the last year and a half, 2 years. And then what's in the middle is a hybrid. We're not going to spend a ton of time on this, just because so many of you have already been dealing with issues related to managing a remote workforce. But this is just a good sort of summary of issues to keep in mind. It's always good to be thinking about this, but again, this will just be a quick overview. But again, given that the pandemic doesn't seem to be ending anytime soon, I think many employers are still going to have some part of their workforce working remotely, either full or part-time. Next slide. So again, these are just some sort of more high-level issues, wage and hour issues. All of these issues relate to having employees working in a place that the employer does not control. And so when the workplace is outside of your control, then you've got bigger concerns, bigger risks with respect to measuring and calculating how many hours are worked and wages paid. Timekeeping issues are certainly important. Having policies about unauthorized work are important. Accommodations, an employee may say, hey, I need to have some ergonomic adjustments to my workstation at home. Again, you should be considering that. Telecommuting, again, if somebody says, I don't want to come in to the office 2 or 3 days a week, but there's your re-entry plan, I want to keep working, as a telecommuter because I have whatever issue it is. One thing that we see from time to time is, I have some mental health issues. Maybe it's related to the pandemic, maybe not, but whatever the source is, like, I've got anxiety and I'm more comfortable at home and I'm more productive. And as the employer, you're in a bit of a tough spot trying to challenge the reasonableness of that accommodation request if that employee has been working with some success over the last 18 months. But again, telecommuting is not anything new. Telecommunicating would be interesting, actually. Telepathy as a form of accommodation. But again, these are just some things that have always been around for remote work, and just keep them in mind. Next slide. And with respect to safety, again, similar issues that you've always dealt with for workplaces that you don't control. You have to make sure that you have a policy in terms of reporting injuries, making sure safety issues are in mind. You might want a protocol for an on-site visit to the remote workplace. It's nice to reserve that right if it's handy if you need it. Training, reporting procedures. Again, we talked about workers' comp. Next slide.
Yeah, so a couple more considerations. Maintaining confidentiality of company information. So this is really going to depend on your industry and what type of confidential information that you're dealing with, whether it be patient information, customer information, or business strategy information. But making sure that you have procedures in place to dissuade and prohibit employees from breaking that confidentiality and releasing that information. I'm sure many of you have a confidentiality policy in a handbook if you have a handbook right now, but tailoring that to remote work, I think, is important if you haven't already. Other more technical precautions that you can take, using secure remote access, making sure employees know not to be doing their their company business than a Starbucks and taking calls, out of Starbucks versus in their home office, keeping information confidential from roommates, things like that, that we might not necessarily have thought about before. Particularly though, this is really important in the context of hybrid employees. Again, thinking about the type of confidential information or sensitive documents that you might be using in your organization. But if you have hybrid employees who are traveling to and from home or to and from the office, it can be wise to have procedures in place establishing how they should, treat documents, by keeping them protected in their car or in their home. And as they travel back and forth, whether documents are allowed to leave the office or whether they should be used fully digitally. So thinking about sort of that from a practical aspect and how that information should be handled. Another issue is related to employee privacy. And this is, of particular concern lately with remote work because people are using potentially personal PCs or personal phones to conduct work. So the extent to which an employee has a right to privacy in those devices and is utilizing company information and doing company business on those devices. And generally, electronic monitoring can be appropriate. We do strongly encourage, employers that do engage in monitoring of email, internet, phone, to have a policy regarding that and let employees know that there's no expectation of privacy as to work being performed on those devices if that is the case, and making sure employees are aware of that so that they can expect that that's going to be happening with regard to their information and their devices. And I think we can go to the next slide. Another important aspect of remote and hybrid work versus in-person work relates to avoiding discrimination issues. So remote and hybrid arrangements can implicate different discrimination concerns, sort of especially with the comparison with in-person work, especially when we think about sort of who's eligible for remote work or who's required to work remotely, as well as the opportunities that are going to be available to people who are working remotely versus in person. There's one nuance sort of that this really comes into play is in regard to caregivers, employees who are in a role taking care of other people. And this has become especially prevalent over the course of the pandemic as schools have been closed or daycares have been closed, family members have been ill. And so employees are put in positions where they need to care for family members. And there are often stereotypes or biases associated with employees who are engaging in the care of others. Women are disproportionately caregivers or primary caregivers for their families. So there might be, stereotypes about women and sort of the amount of time that they're spending engaging in caretaking responsibilities, the extent to which that would interfere with their additional responsibilities at work or with getting a promotion at work. Likewise, the coin flipped, there might be a stereotype that men are not engaged as caregivers, and so they have more time to give to work or things like that. So, although these might not be outright assumptions about employees, I think it's important to recognize that these stereotypes and assumptions might sort of live as implicit biases in ourselves. And I know many of you have heard that term before, but if you haven't, it's a sort of a bias under the surface that can still affect our decision making. And it's important to recognize that because those sorts of assumptions can potentially act as the basis for denying a promotion or not giving certain good assignments to certain employees if we assume that they can't handle it because they're working remotely. There's been research that suggests that remote workers are already less likely to earn promotions and that remote workers understand this and feel like they have less opportunities. So it's important to be mindful and consistent in the way that we are treating in remote workers, assigning remote work, and making assumptions about people who have remote work situations or hybrid versus purely in person. And next slide. And just briefly, to address sort of all of these concerns that we've been talking about, you'll hear me say it again, I encourage you to have a policy sort of outlining the specifics for remote work, who's eligible, what expected work hours are going to be, how company information is going to be protected, whether there are any changes to job duties based on working remotely or in person. Also reminders to comply with other policies of an organization, particularly your anti-discrimination and anti-harassment laws or policies, which will apply, of course, to remote workers as well as in person. And for those of you who have a handbook and already have a remote work policy, it might be a good idea to update your remote work policy based on sort of the practical realities of what we've been seeing over the past few months. And if you don't have a handbook or policy, it's always a good idea to implement one. Lastly, Rob mentioned sort of the issue with people working in Texas as an example of how different laws might apply. That's the same sort of for remote work generally, keeping in mind where people are performing the work because it might have different implications for you with regard to payroll taxes or state laws that might apply. So just something to keep in mind when we have remote workers.
Yeah, and then further to that point, I mean, if you have an employee in, say, Texas or any other state, you may need to register to do business in that state if you're making withholdings for payroll taxes, or even if you're not. I mean, you've got an employee, you arguably have a place of business there. I understand this is a state by state analysis as to whether that state considers you doing business in that state. So there's no one rule, but it's something to think about. Also, I think we're thinking about whether, communicating your expectation about the accessibility and job duties, and I'll sort of woven into that is, do you expect your employees to be sort of nearby the office when you want them to work, or do you care? Like with my nephew that I used as an example a little while ago, he's an IT person, could be anywhere on the planet, and his employer didn't care. But we've got some employers like, well, we want you to be able to come in for a meeting maybe, or come in for, 1 day a week or whatever. And so what we are hearing, and I've had several calls like this, there's a discovery that an employee has decided, they got their shot, they're not taking a vacation or leave of absence, but they're working from France or Utah or Nevada. Like, well, I thought they were, around. And so if you don't care where they are, then fine. But if you have an expectation that they be around and they be working, I mean, we've had, again, your stories about people like, they're putting on their Facebook page, there are pictures of them with the Eiffel Tower in the background, and their manager's surprised, like, geez, I thought they were supposed to be at working from home in Scarborough. And maybe they're not doing as much work as I thought they were doing. It looks like they're doing more sightseeing. So again, that sort of expectation would be worth communicating if you have a preference for it. So why don't we go on to the next slide, which is, boy, we're getting into the really controversial stuff now. So we'll try to get through this as efficiently as we can. But this is an area where I think Peter said, we're going to give some clarity to the situation, and I will tell you in advance, we can't do that. I mean, it's we'll do our best. But this issue about employee vaccination is just, it's totally completely fluid. It's decisions are coming out from courts like every day in the last 2 weeks or last month. I mean, it is, we'll get to one that came out yesterday relevant to Maine. And we can actually go to the next slide. But this is a hot topic, and so we're really going to try to give you the lay of the land, issue spot. But just by way of a sort of advanced disclosure, I mean, I think if you get to a place where you want to mandate vaccines, or you want to terminate somebody or otherwise suspend somebody for not having a vaccine, the COVID vaccine, you may want to get legal counsel, because this is a pretty sticky area. So what's happening in Maine right now? Right now, the primary law, or rule rather, is this rule that came out about, was announced about in August and promulgated immediately, I think August 12th. It basically said that if there are certain healthcare providers in Maine, if basically employers who run certain designated healthcare facilities, then every employee in those facilities have to get the COVID vaccine. And the first deadline was October 1st. The governor pushed that back to October 29, saying, well, we're not going to enforce it until the 29th of October, which is of course coming right up. And so initially the coverage on this was a little bit media coverage a little bit vague about, is it all healthcare workers? And I think a lot of companies and employers were surprised to discover, no, it's just certain healthcare facilities that have licenses to operate, like a hospital, a nursing home, certain group homes for adults, things like that. But a regular medical office, for instance, your dermatology office, would not likely be covered unless it's owned by a covered facility like a hospital, say. There's no religious exemption, and this is a big deal. There's litigation all over the country, including Maine. Just yesterday, Judge Levy, the U.S. District Court judge here in Maine, denied a motion for a preliminary injunction that would have prevented the state from denying religious exemptions for this healthcare worker mandate. He wrote a 41-page opinion, which I haven't finished reading yet, but it's, I skimmed through it, but it's a pretty exhaustive discussion of the legal issues. But again, just the day before, a judge in New York State went the opposite direction and said the state of New York was enjoined from implementing or enforcing a healthcare worker vaccine mandate. So these are issues that are in flux. They're going up to the courts of appeal. We'll probably get to the U.S. Supreme Court in the next few months. I think the Supreme Court's been waiting for these cases to get a little more fully baked and reviewed by the lower courts before they weigh in on it. So stay tuned. It may be that if you're a healthcare provider and you're not recognizing religious exemptions, if the Supreme Court goes the other way, you may be getting people knocking on your door saying, you need to bring me back because your denial of my religious exemption was unlawful. Oh, and by the way, my lawyer's going to send you a letter. I mean, so this is not a great position for employers to be in. So with respect to the Maine rule for healthcare workers, again, this was an emergency rule that's only in effect for 90 days. The state DHHS is in the process of finalizing a rule that would probably take into effect in November, and so that rule's in circulation. But importantly, there is an exemption for medical conditions or people with disabilities, but there's an open question as to whether someone who is unvaccinated because of a legitimate medical condition is able to be in the facility, because there's an ambiguity the way the rule is written, that if you're not immunized, then a health officer can order that person not be in the facility, and it doesn't carve out an exception for somebody who's got an exemption. So I'm not sure how that's going to turn out. There's also some question as to whether someone who's got natural immunity from having a prior infection is going to be exempt, or will not so much exempt, but satisfy the immunity requirement by the rule. And so as the emergency rule suggests that having natural immunity is something that would qualify someone qualify someone as being immune and therefore able to work and not have to get the vaccine, as long as they've got some independent medical proof. Like laboratory evidence. The draft final rule, however, would essentially write that out of the rule and basically say that natural immunity doesn't count. And of course, that's a real hot button issue in many settings, and in terms of like, how can the state deny science, and the federal government deny that natural infection promotes, immunity? I'm not a medical expert, obviously, but there seem to be a lot of doctors and other experts out there who are taking the position like, well, we're scratching their heads like, how come the U.S. government or in other states don't recognize natural immunity? Israel does, England does, France does, at least to some degree. So that's a real hot button issue, and so stay tuned for this. Vaccine rates are increasing at many facilities, and again, I think even just the threat of this vaccine mandate being imposed has resulted in the rates of the holdouts essentially getting the shot. I think push comes to shove, when it's a job or a jab, people will take the jab to keep the job, and that's what we're seeing. Of course, there may be some collateral damage to that kind of coercion, and we can talk about that in the next. Well, actually, we're going to talk about the federal contractor vaccine mandate next, but we'll talk about some of the other collateral issues in a few minutes. Next slide. We got it. Thanks. So what's going on at the federal level? There's been a lot of media coverage about this. President Biden announced just a few weeks ago that the if you're a federal contractor, that all employees have to get the COVID vaccine. There had been a prior executive order from the summer where he said that it's a vaccinate or test, and so, weekly testing was an available option. That was eliminated by President Biden in his most recent executive order. And it's amazing how many companies are federal contractors or subcontractors. I mean, it's like 25% of the U.S. Business economy, which is a good reminder, I guess, as to how important the federal government is as a consumer of goods and services. So lots of companies are covered here: IT, banking, construction, even legal services, manufacturing. So it's good to remember, however, if you are a federal contractor, this just applies to new or renewed contracts after October 15. And so for these future contracts, October 15, which is, gosh, it's tomorrow, it's creeping right up on us. So basically all new contracts have to have a mandated vaccination clause within them. And again, it's all contractors and subcontractors as well to that prime contract. Interestingly, and this is important, so as on September 24, there was some guidance published by the White House on this. In this guidance, they spoke to remote workers. What if you have an employee who's essentially working remotely? They're covered. They got it by the mandate, which to some seems illogical, but generally speaking, the scope of this federal contractor vaccine requirement is exceptionally broad. And we're going to talk about Liz is in a minute is going to talk about the OSHA requirement, but that's going to drop, we think, any day. But we'll keep talking about the federal contractor mandate just for a minute more. Next slide. And with respect to the this federal contractor mandate, some more details here. What are your additional obligations? So it's all employees. There are exemptions though. So medical or health conditions and religious exemptions. So it's interesting how for the federal contractor vaccine mandate, they do recognize religious exemptions, even if the state of Maine doesn't. So there's an interesting divergence. And I think certainly with healthcare, you could make a pretty good case that healthcare is different from making missiles, for instance. So of course, there are probably healthcare providers who provide services to the federal government, where arguably, you have similar issues that would arise. So you're supposed to have a person who is going to coordinate your COVID workplace safety efforts, and this is a mandate. Again, takes effect on December 8, 2021, which is a date you've probably seen in the media with respect to, I think, some of the airline vaccine mandates, which we'll talk about in a couple minutes. So next, I'll turn this back over to Liz to talk about the OSHA mandate. Yeah,
so we're actually just ahead of the curve on this, unfortunately, but fortunately, on Tuesday, actually this week, so just a couple days ago, OSHA sent a draft rule to the White House for final review on the 100 employee mandate. So we do expect that in the next couple of days. But basically, if you haven't heard, the mandate is going to be a vaccination mandate for employers with 100 or more employees. It's going to be all private employers, not just those that are providing federal services pursuant to federal contracts. Or, of course, weekly testing is supposed to be the alternative option. Employers are also going to be required to provide paid time off to get the vaccine or recover from any side effects from the vaccine that employees might be experiencing. So there was no public comment taken on the rule. And it does carry a pretty significant penalty of up to just about $14,000 per violation, which is the maximum penalty that OSHA can impose. Next slide. So because we are still waiting for the final rule to be released, there are still a bunch of questions that we don't know. So we wanted to highlight a couple of them for you to sort of pay attention to and ask yourself and look for when the final rule is released. I think most significantly and relevant to many of you is going to be who gets counted toward the 100 employee threshold. So is it going to be something similar to FMLA where it's, a certain number of employees for a certain number of weeks throughout the prior year? Is it going to be 100 employees as of a certain date? How are different locations going to be combined or not combined to create the 100 employee threshold? So that's something to definitely keep an eye on, especially for seasonal employers that might have 100 employees at some points during the year, but not others. Another outstanding question is who's going to pay for the testing? This one we actually might know the answer to already. Under Maine law, medical testing that's required by the employer is required to be paid for by the employer. So that will likely fall on the employer to pay for testing. Non-exempt employees, do they need to be paid for the time that they spend getting tested? Again, this might be similar to another medical examination required by an employer that they do need to be paid for that time under the FLSA. How will we verify vaccination status? Is it going to be just a verbal affirmation? Do we get a copy of the vaccine card? Something else? So something else to be aware of in the final rule. Next slide, please. We've talked a little bit about natural immunity, but will that be considered as an aspect of any aspect under the federal rule or mandate? Will they be treated like vaccinated employees? Will boosters be required under the rule? Especially given what we know about potentially vaccines effectiveness wearing off after a certain number of months, and as people are becoming eligible for boosters, depending on whether they're immunocompromised or age. Will the mandate say anything about whether boosters are required? Medical and religious exemptions is going to be a big one. We do have medical, disability related and religious exemptions under the federal contractor mandate, but as we've been talking about, the state mandates that are going into effect across the country are really varying with regard to whether they have those exemptions. So be aware of requirements under the federal mandate, as well as sort of how those might interact if they're not available with other laws that do require the exemptions. And lastly, I'm sure many of you have heard about sort of potential risks with vaccine incentive programs that are overly coercive, becoming ERISA plans or subject to ERISA obligations. So it's another consideration to keep in mind as we wait for that rule. Next slide.
Yeah, so, with respect to this OSHA rule, there's litigation is guaranteed. I understand 24 state attorneys general have already announced that they will sue the second this thing hits the media. We have kind of preview of what it contains. Yesterday, we learned that the Department of Labor sent the draft rule up to the White House for approval, but all indications are that the White House is going to be approving this very, very quickly. So it could be today or tomorrow this thing gets rolled out, and the litigation is I'm sure is going to follow, the next day, if not the same day. So, what are some of the issues in terms of this, the OSHA mandate? Why would so many states attorney general bristle at this particular rule? Well, OSHA's emergency temporary standards or emergency rulemaking authority is limited, again, as a justification for bypassing the notice and comment, the public notice and comment process, which is baked into the development of every single federal rule, state rule too, for that matter. If they're going to skip that, then there's got to be some new hazard that poses a grave danger to workers. So many commentators are saying that, we've been dealing with COVID for almost 2 years now. This is not a new hazard. And the rule arguably implies, or this OSHA rule, emergency rule, applies that there's some grave danger that's somewhat, unique or specific to the particular industry. There's like a chemical, or there's some new hazard. It's not so much designed to apply to sort of an epidemic where it's a universal risk to workers. Another potential challenge is why are you picking 100 employees? So you're saying that employees that work for an employer with only 99 employees are not exposed to this grave danger, but employees who work for a company that has 100 or more are exposed to this grave danger. so logically, there's not a strong case to make a distinction there. And again, public agencies are supposed to make rules that are not arbitrary, that are rational, and rules that are arbitrary on their face or somewhat vulnerable to challenge. The history of this emergency standard rulemaking by OSHA is pretty limited. There's been about 6 or 7 of these, 7 times in the last, 20 years or so, where OSHA has used its emergency temporary standard power to promulgate rules. And in all but one of those instances, the rule has been thrown out in litigation. They've been successfully challenged. So, and again, why would the states be so cranked about this? The Constitution gives the power to the states to address public health and safety, and according to many governors and attorneys general, mostly in Republican-controlled states, that this is an overreach by the federal government to use the OSHA mechanism as a way to essentially impose a federal mandate with a rule that wasn't designed for that. So we'll see. Stay tuned.
Rob,
and yes,
Rob, it's Peter, and Rob and Liz, both of you. I'd be interested. I've had some feedback from some businesses who will fall under this, who have said, we don't necessarily like mandates, but we didn't want to be the ones to force our employees to get vaccinated. So now the feds have come along and said, well, you've got to do this. So this gives us some cover when we wanted to do it anyhow. What was your comments? What's your feeling on that issue?
Yeah, well, you're essentially parroting what the CEO of Southwest Airlines said over the weekend, or just a couple of days ago. And we can go to the next slide, actually. In terms of other legal issues, yeah, some employers are like, yeah, we don't want to get into the vaccine mandate issue. We'd rather not do it. Looks pretty heavy-handed. We may have some employees who don't like this. But now that the feds are making us, okay, the decision's made for us. So that's exactly what Southwest Airlines CEO said to the media 2 days ago, when he was explaining why they had to cancel 3,000 flights over the last weekend. And so I think that was a clear signal to his employees, like, hey, I didn't want to do it, because as you probably heard, the official line is that was those 3,000 flights, plus or minus, that Southwest had to cancel had nothing to do with the vaccine mandate that the company had announced. Again, because of this of the federal contractor executive order, because Southwest has some federal contracts. They carry mail for the U.S. Postal Service, and they also are available to carry, I think, people for the military. So it's a pretty small amount of their business. It's less than 3% apparently, but they're still a federal contractor. And so, so the scuttlebutt was, the official story was it was weather-related delays in Florida and some air traffic control issues. The unofficial story that you hear is that it was a sick out by the pilots union, and also maybe by the air traffic controllers, the Jacksonville Air Control Center in Florida, that those two groups got together, or whether they coordinated it or just by coincidence, just called out sick, and that paralyzed Southwest. And so, as a labor lawyer who deals with the Railway Labor Act and other union issues, the sick out story hangs together. We see this pretty often in labor relations, whereby under a contract, under the Railway Labor Act, the pilots can't strike without notice, advance notice. And under their either contract with Southwest Airlines, they couldn't strike without violating the no strike clause. So of course the union's going to say, this isn't a strike. We're not doing anything here, because if they were to admit that it was a strike, they would be exposing themselves as the union to tens of millions of dollars in damages. So, and from the company's perspective, they probably don't want anybody else to get the idea that, hey, we can cripple any airline by just calling out sick. And so, but to me, the fact that this was probably a sick out, like a wildcat strike is what we would call it, is that on last Friday, the Southwest Airline Pilot Union filed a motion for a temporary restraining order to enjoin Southwest from applying this vaccine mandate, the federal contractor vaccine mandate, to the airline and to its pilots. So this strikes me as not a coincidence. And so I think the employers are in a spot who just, like, they don't necessarily want to be the person with a heavy hand here who comes in and says you have to get the vaccine as a condition of employment. But again, this Southwest case really highlights the risks that these mandates bring to employers, and not just getting whipsawed between inconsistent state rules and federal rules. Which law do I comply with? But also employees engaging in wildcat strikes. I mean, you saw the headlines in, was it yesterday's newspaper, in the Press Herald talked about Central Maine Medical Center shutting down, or we need to shut down its trauma unit, neonatal unit, and some other units because the vaccine mandate that the governor has implemented for healthcare workers is going to require them to fire enough of their staff that they'll have to curtail those services. In addition to the public safety issue, you've got revenue issues for the hospital. I mean, these are some pretty serious consequences that are playing out here with these vaccine mandates. And I think employers are in a spot where, like, hey, we didn't create this. Why are we? And some employers are all over this. We want to mandate vaccines, and I think those employers, may find themselves perhaps at the front of the line if there's some labor unrest. So it's a very fluid situation. There's a lot of risk all around. And I guess, my advice would be tread carefully in any of this. I mean, we don't know how this is going to play out. So if you start firing people because they don't get the vaccine, what if a court reverses or invalidates either the state or federal rule, or you guess wrong on an accommodation request? Let's say you're not covered by either the state or federal rules. And you're sued by an employee who said, hey, I have a disability or I have a religious exemption, and you unreasonably denied my request to keep working. There's some exposure there as well. In some respects, like, who would you rather get sued by? The federal agency that says you're violating our rule, or by an employee, or by a customer? So it's a really dangerous, tricky area. Some other things to think about. Again, we touched on this. You really want to keep abreast of the science here. I think if you've got a belief about whether it's the infection rate or the effectiveness of vaccines or their threat of unvaccinated people, and that's based on data that's 6 months old, you're arguably setting yourself up to make a decision that isn't based on the most up-to-date science and up-to-date law, for that matter. So the studies, as Liz alluded to, the efficacy of the vaccines is sort of an open question now. How long do they last? So Israel, for instance, they're probably one of the most vaccinated countries in the world. They've got a special deal with Pfizer. That's what they use exclusively. And, they recently came to the conclusion, based on a spike in breakthrough cases, that, that they needed to get everybody boosted with a third shot. And they have this green pass system that says you can't go to a restaurant or a bar or travel without a green pass, your phone saying, yeah, I'm safe, I've been vaccinated. So they've they took the position just a few weeks ago that if your vaccine is more than 6 months old, you're not vaccinated. So your green pass stopped working. And so if you want that thing to start working again, you got to get a booster. So that's a pretty interesting development, and that's the country, their health ministry. So this is not just like one company. So that's an important thing to think about. So for instance, if you're dealing with an accommodation request and you've got an employee who says, hey, I've got a medical condition, I can't get the shot, and you say, okay, well, we can try to accommodate that. What's your request? And the employee says, well, I want you to treat me just like that every other employee who had the vaccine. Well, why would you do that? Well, because anybody who's had the vaccine more than 6 months ago is basically the same as an unvaccinated person, at least based on the Israeli data. So, what are you going to do then? You could point to the CDC website, which says, if you're vaccinated, that's as good as, it's indefinite protection. But again, I think if you get sued, the data that exists at the time you make the decision is going to be what's relevant to whether you are liable or not. Some other things to think about: workers' comp concerns. If vaccines are mandated, arguably that these things are now, if there's an injury, an adverse reaction, then that is very likely to be an injury that arises out of in the course of employment and is therefore compensable. And so, my advice is you think about, if you've got a vaccine mandate and somebody gets the shot, calls up and says, geez, I can't come in tomorrow because I'm too sick. then you may want to consider filing a first report if there's lost time and somebody says it's related to the mandated shot. Why would you want to do that? Because why do you want to file a first report? It's going to mess up my my experience modifier. You know, that's another injury to report. Well, to the extent that that employee claims a delayed injury, you know, like, or lingering symptoms, because we know that President Biden has said in his OSHA mandate, he wants to make it clear that employees who have side effects get paid for the time off. Geez, that sounds like workers' comp, right? You know, paid for missing time from work due to a work injury. And so if you don't file that first report, the statute of limitations never starts to run. So you could have a situation where an employee claims that they have some delayed onset neurological injury that that they attribute to the vaccine. They'll just say, well, yeah, I had this numbness in my arm and after the shot and it never went away. And now I've got some degenerative nerve condition. And, you know, so 2 or 3 years from now, you're litigating, or 5 years from now, you're litigating whether this person has a debilitating injury from the vaccine. So I think you ought to seriously consider filing a first report. OSHA has taken the position that you don't have to report this on your log, the OSHA 300 log, not because it's not reportable or recordable, rather they're just not going to enforce it until next year. So they took that position back in April or May, when initially they said you should be recording vaccine injuries if they're mandated by the employer. So I think, interestingly, to the extent that there's going to be litigation around vaccine injuries, the workers' compensation boards around the country may be the forum that these issues get litigated, because the vaccine manufacturers and the healthcare industry, they basically have immunity under federal law for any vaccine injury. So anyway, stay tuned. It's a pretty interesting place to litigate this issue. So
Rob, I would just add that at the recent workers' comp summit, they had can't remember if you were there or not, but they had a panel with a plaintiff's attorney and an employer attorney and an ALJ, and cases like this came up. Is it covered? Is it not covered? And the issue of a vaccine related injury came up. And, you know, while the employer and the employee's attorneys may have differed, the ALJ is what counted, and they indicated that they would consider it compensable. So, FYI.
Yeah, I mean, this is going to be a battle of experts, and you know, you'll have experts on both sides who will be fully credentialed, and, you know, I mean, the workers' comp board is pretty well equipped to deal with that. Although, generally speaking, they're more orthopedic experts that you deal with at the board, not immunology or neurologists, but, you know, they're not totally incapable of dealing with that. So it's going to be interesting. And then I guess, you know, then next we had some hypotheticals. I know we've run over by a few minutes. And again, there's so much stuff here to talk about. I apologize for us moving rather briskly through all this. But I hope we've given you a sense of the legal landscape here for vaccine mandates, which is just, it's changing under our feet every day. So, but if you want, Peter, you know, I'll defer to you. We can. I was just going to say, we've still got people hanging in there. So if you want to run through the hypotheticals quickly, I would tell you to do it. All right. So I think, Liz, you were going to maybe take a swing at this first one.
Yeah, so I'll run through the first one. So we have a hypothetical here, which assumes that an employer requires employees to return to work in the facility, and the employer requires all employees receive a COVID-19 vaccine. So we also have an employee who refuses the vaccine based on a medical condition or disability and requests accommodation to keep working remotely. So the question is, must the employer allow the employee to continue working remotely? So the answer, like most things in our field, is it depends. So, you know, one of the first questions we would want to ask in this situation is, you know, we know that the employee has a medical condition or says that they have a medical condition, and that's the basis for refusing the vaccine. But we want to establish whether or not the employee has a disability that would prevent them from getting the vaccine, sort of as a threshold question to determine whether they're going to be a qualified individual with a disability. So at that point, if we have established that and they do have a qualifying, you know, disability that would exempt them from getting the vaccine, we need to think about whether the ability to work remotely would be a reasonable accommodation. So for that would be going into your interactive process and determining whether that's a viable option under the circumstances. So here, under this set of facts, if we think about the fact that the employee has been working remotely for a significant amount of time already, it might be that working remotely going forward would be reasonable because they've established that they can do the work remotely and that is a viable option for them to continue performing their essential duties. So, in that case, that could potentially be an accommodation for the vaccine exemption. If the employee is not able to continue working remotely, let's say that they are unable to and they really need to be in the workplace, that is where we get into a little bit trickier of an analysis and need to think about sort of what risk the employee poses to the workplace and whether they're a direct threat to the health and safety of others under the ADA, which is a little bit more of an intensive analysis to figure out whether there is going to be a reasonable accommodation, such as masking, social distancing, changing up sort of a workplace location, those safety measures that we talked about earlier, whether those types of measures will allow, or would allow for a reasonable accommodation to not get the vaccine based on that disability. This, of course, is going to be industry specific, that analysis. And it's also going to, sort of require a consideration of, whether we are or should be treating vaccinated and unvaccinated employees differently. We've sort of talked about that already in the presentation today, but in terms of transmission and risk, how that one employee being unvaccinated affects the workplace or how the workplace is going to affect them. So a little bit trickier of a situation. So the subset hypothetical of this is whether there's any difference based on a religious accommodation request. And the answer is, sort of. We still need to go through the same analysis of whether an accommodation is reasonable. But there's a little bit different of an assessment under a disability consideration because of the ADA's direct threat defense, which allows employers to treat individuals with disabilities differently if they do qualify under that direct threat analysis, which isn't necessarily available for the religious exemption or isn't the same analysis. So those are some of the things that would be considered sort of in that situation.
Yeah, and this is why it's important to get advice, because it's a pretty technical area, and especially with the ADA disability analysis, this has to be an assessment based on objective evidence. So it's not so much, oh well, the CDC says this, although that could be a relevant consideration, but the statute speaks to, or the rules speak to, objective evidence that the employee poses a direct threat to themselves or others, and then an individualized assessment about a number of factors like the duration of the risk and the nature and the severity of the harm. How long is the potential harm going to be, or is this risk going to be around? Like, are we in a wave? Are we in a trough in this pandemic? So all these factors that come into play. And one of the things that makes this sort of tricky for us is that, most of the time when we deal with a direct threat case, it's with an employee who's already got a disease like hepatitis, right? So you've got someone who's really, who's infected or infectious or both. And here we're talking about someone who's unvaccinated who, if they don't have symptoms and they're, we used to call people who were otherwise healthy without symptoms healthy people, right? So, so how much risk is there of a person who's otherwise healthy who's unvaccinated? And so that creates or adds some uncertainty to the analysis. And that, again, to the point I made earlier about the waning protectiveness of the current versions of these COVID shots, that if they do wane over time, how much difference is there between someone who got their shot in January versus someone who doesn't have a shot but who's otherwise healthy in terms of the risk that they pose? I don't know the answer to that, but I think you may get differing expert opinions on that question. So, and again, even with the religious request or religious basis for the exemption, you sort of end up in the same place as like what's the difference in risk between a unvaccinated person who's otherwise healthy and a vaccinated person who, whether they got vaccinated this last week or 6 months ago or 8 months ago. And I think that was about all I had to say on hypothetical 1. So hypothetical 2, this is a quick one, relatively quick, I think. So basically, you have a vaccinated employee who says, I don't want to work with this unvaccinated coworker for safety reasons. Does an employer have to accommodate that request? We've actually been getting this question a lot, or at least from time to time. Like, there's a lot of anxiety around the pandemic, and even among vaccinated people. President Biden, as he rolled out these executive orders, said words to the effect, we have to protect the vaccinated from the unvaccinated, which is, anyway, that's what he said. So that seems to be kind of the thinking of a lot of people. The vaccinated people needed to be protected from unvaccinated people, which again, logically is a little interesting, because I thought the vaccines were supposed to protect you from unvaccinated people. But again, there's a lot of people who are anxious about being around unvaccinated people. And I think as a general, proposition, our view is that, the vaccinated person doesn't immediately fall into a protected category. They don't have a disability. There's no religious issue there. It's just a person who's got a safety issue. So that kind of puts them into a whistleblower category, at least under Maine law. And as I mentioned earlier, that statute's been weaponized pretty effectively. And so anybody who complains about working around an unvaccinated person for safety reasons may have some rights, but there is some case law that, as I mentioned earlier, that suggests that if it's a known risk to the company, like understaffing in a healthcare facility, if everybody knows about it, then an employee complaining continually about understaffing isn't really engaging in protected activity by reporting stuff that everybody already knows. So I think here I think the employer's option is basically talk to that person, address that person's anxieties, and see if you can address them. But one thing to think about, though, and this relates to the federal vaccine mandates, there's no enforcement mechanism specified, that at least not yet. I think the commentators are saying, well, the expectation is that people are just going to complain to OSHA. Or especially if you've got, let's say an employer is not mandating vaccines, but is looking the other way on the OSHA rule, then I think OSHA is expecting that employees essentially be whistleblowers and sort of rat out their employers if they're not careful or rigorously enforcing the vaccine mandate. So anyway, that's sort of the expectation. Why don't we go to the next slide? I think, oh yeah, this is, so let's say you've got a customer or client who refuses to work with your unvaccinated employee. And, what do? Customer says, I only accept vaccinated people on my premises. And let's say you're an employer who doesn't have a mandate. And, but you do have safety protocols. People only come to work if they're healthy, if they don't have a temperature, if they've been around someone who's infected, they're supposed to quarantine. Let's say you do all that. And you've got a person who, you're going to a service person you're going to send out to the client. What do you do? So I think that the answer is, like with all these hypotheticals, it depends. If that employee has not been given a medical exemption or religious exemption from getting a vaccine, let's assume the employer has a mandate, or let's assume the employer has no mandate. They just have employees that they leave it up to their employees. And I think, honestly, that's the majority of employers right now. I think that the statistics I've seen is about 75% of employers have not implemented vaccine mandates. That number doesn't get a lot of press, but I think that's our experience, at least even internally, and even what I've read when you can find it. The news is generated by those employers who implement mandates, not by those who don't. But let's assume there's no mandate here. And I think in that case, the company is in a position where I think this is a decision like, do I tell the employee I'm not going to send them out to the client or not let them work with that client or customer? And that's more of an employee relations issue if the employee doesn't have a medical or religious reason, or do I satisfy do I anger the client by sending out an unvaccinated person? So it's sort of a business conflict. So the employer is kind of in a no-win situation. But if that employee has received or has a disability and says, hey, I can't get the vaccine for a medical reason, then there's an argument that, okay, that employee is not protected. They have a legal right to an accommodation. And let's say they can wear masks. They can, let's say they're working outside as a lawnmower, right? Or a groundskeeper. arguably the risk is exceptionally low that they would get anybody sick at the customer or client. So what happens then? I think that employer is someone in the crosshairs of a disability claim, failure to accommodate under the Maine Human Rights Act and maybe the ADA. And importantly, too, if the customer or client may face some exposure under the Maine Human Rights Act, generally speaking, individuals or non-employers are not exposed to liability under the Maine Human Rights Act because that mostly deals with employers. But there is a provision that says it's unlawful for a person to discriminate against an individual because that, or nor can they interfere or coerce or intimidate any individual in the exercise or enjoyment of their rights that are protected by the Act. And so this is a law, Section 4633 of the Maine Human Rights Act, that applies to third parties, including individuals. And the First Circuit Court of Appeals actually held 2 years ago that these third parties can be liable for violations of the Maine Human Rights Act that they cause. So in that fact pattern, it was a healthcare provider to the Maine Department of Corrections, so the jails. And this independent contractor had an employee who said she was harassed by her employer and also by employees of the jail, who are state employees for the Department of Corrections. And the state essentially said to the to the healthcare provider, we don't want that person on site anymore. She's too much of a troublemaker. And so the employee was fired. She sued not just the employer, she also sued the client, which was the Maine Department of Corrections and some individual supervisors. District Court dismissed her claims against the state of Maine. The First Circuit Court of Appeals reversed, saying that, hey, this law, Section 4633, clearly says that a person, including a non-employer, can be liable if they interfere, coerce, or intimidate any individual in the exercise or enjoyment of their rights. So basically here, the court said the state of Maine Department of Corrections forced this woman's employer to fire her. That was actionable. So if you were thinking about saying, hey, we're not going to let anybody who's unvaccinated come onto our property, you may be setting yourself up for liability under Section 4633 if that employee who's being denied access has some either medical or religious exemption from getting vaccinated. So with that, that's the end of our show. So we can move to the next slide of the disclaimer. Thank you so much for spending this hour and a half with us. This is a lot of information that we threw at you today, but there's just so much happening. It's hard to cover it in a short amount of time. And if you do have questions, feel free to send us an email. Our slides should be available by now. I think they were in the chat.
They are.
Chat box. So again, thank you so much for being with us today. Thanks to the Chamber for having us, and be well, be safe. And if you have any questions, give us a call. Thanks.
Yeah, and I just want to say to both Rob and Liz, thank you very much, and thank Verrill Law for their presentation and their sponsorship of this webinar this morning. We did go over, but I think it was well worth it to have those hypotheticals up there for folks. Again, these presentations live on because it is recorded, and we do make them available on the website. We will be shooting them out through social media as well. And so we really appreciate you are joining us this morning and being our presenters. Angie, I think we have a couple of other people to thank before we're done. Or maybe not.
We do, Pete. Hang on, I just have to switch the slideshows.
Yes.
There.
Again, I want to thank Verrill Law for being our sponsor and presenter today, our community sponsors, Bangor Savings Bank, Northern Light Health, St. Germain, and our supporting sponsors, Central Maine Power, Eaton Peabody, and Memic. To all of you, thank you for joining us. I hope you have a great rest of your week and stay safe. And again, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to both Rob and Elizabeth. They did put their email addresses up earlier. The presentation will be made available to folks as well. I believe we had talked about that. So to all of you, thank you very much and have a great rest of your day.